Welcome to Multi-Family Method, a podcast which explores the state of the multifamily real estate market and some of the backgrounds, methodologies, and words of wisdom from some of today's most successful multifamily real estate entrepreneurs nationwide. Welcome to the Multi-Family Method, a podcast that explores the state of the multifamily real estate market and some of the backgrounds, methodologies, and words of wisdom from some of today's most successful multifamily real estate entrepreneurs. Hi, I'm Mike Mosher. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we're going to be interviewing Chris Bruen. Chris Bruen is the Senior Director of Research at NMHC. He oversees aiding in and expanding upon NMHC's research in housing and economics. Prior to joining NMHC, Chris conducted research on the behavioral tendencies exhibited by option traders and served as a contributor to the Shanghai-based business publication morningwhistle.com, where he wrote on topics relating to Sino-American economic policy. Chris holds a bachelor's degree in finance from George Washington University and an MS in economics from Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to the podcast, Chris. I'd love to start with the perspective on rents and what we've seen and what a wild ride it's been through 21 and now up to, we're recording this podcast mid-October of 23. So kind of talk us through that story a little bit. What are you seeing in terms of rents with multifamily around the country?
Sure. So, yeah, I really like to kind of zoom out and take a 3-year look back of the kind of post the COVID period on. And so we started in 2020, if you recall, with demand really falling off. Mm-hmm. And we saw some negative annual rent growth. I get a lot of our data from RealPage and also from CoStar. RealPage reported that effective asking rents fell 1.2% year over year as of the fourth quarter of 2020. And then in 2021, if you recall, early on in the year, vaccines started to be distributed. Rental assistance funds were being distributed as well. And demand really came surging back and overwhelmed the available supply. And rent growth took off in turn, which really peaked in the first quarter of 2022. RealPage has data that says 15.3% year over year in the first quarter of 2022. CoStar asking rent growth of 10% growth year over year. And then after the first quarter of 2022, we saw rent growth begin to moderate, which we're still kind of in this moderation phase due to first off, during that surge of rent growth that really spurred a lot of housing construction, which we're seeing those units start to come online, and also the series of interest rate hikes enacted by the Fed is increasing the amount of economic uncertainty and starting to slow the economy, which is having a dampening effect on demand. And so that leaves us, the latest data I've seen in the second quarter of this year shows 2.4% rent growth year over year from RealPage and 1.2% year over year from CoStar. So it's pretty wide fluctuations over the past few years. When you average that from the second quarter of 2019 to second quarter of this year, I'll have to check my math on this, Tony. It's I believe it's just around like 5% growth on average. So not as extreme. I feel like everyone kind of remembers the headlines from late 2021, early 2022, and you kind of forget that rents did dip in 2020 and they've moderated since. And especially when you account for inflation being higher, and if you're an apartment operator, what you really care about, right, is inflation adjusted rent growth, the degree to which rent growth is exceeding inflation. And that has actually been lower in these past 3 years than in the preceding 5 years. So I think a lot of people see some of that headline nominal rent growth and think that apartment owners are really raking it in and doing well. But I think it's also been a bit of a challenging environment when you account for that inflation.
Yeah, that's actually quite an interesting point, Chris. A lot there to unpack. So a couple comments. If you take that 4-year snapshot from Q2 2019 through this year, you mentioned a 5% average, which is in line. We're typically seeing 3 to 5% rent growth averages in our industry over the last couple decades. But what was unique about this go round was that it nearly all happened in a 12-month period of time, right? Call it mid to late 21 to early 22. There was the peak of the mountain, right? And then everything kind of came down. It was down before that, down after that. So that was a very unique event that was singular in my experience. Just hadn't seen a peak that fast, then a drop off. So yes, the averages remain true, but it was unique in how it rolled out. The other piece you talk about, which is interesting, which is the inflation adjusted piece. You're right. There's a lot of clickbait out there in the media about rents and what's going on with rents, but they forget to look at it relative to the entire basket of goods that consumers consume, quite frankly, the CPI index and the like, right? So I'm curious if you've ever seen rent as a percent of income, because that to me feels like a more true number, because if incomes are rising faster than rents, which is the data I'm seeing this year, by the way, wasn't true last year, then again, the relative affordability piece is fine. It's just the whole world's moving up.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. So we, over a much longer period of time, the share of cost burdened renter households, apartment households, and really all households has been increasing. So housing has become less affordable over time. I'm not really sure about like maybe last year, if you're talking about incomes increasing faster than rents, that might be the case. But I guess also if you're an apartment owner, you're concerned with apartment income specifically. And so there are a lot of reasons why you might still have very strong demand from that upper end. One of which being the cost of home ownership being so high right now, given the rapid appreciation of home prices and rising interest rates. For those people who would have otherwise bought a home, are more likely to be on the higher end of the income distribution. They will now be renting.
Yeah, so that's really more on the demand side as well, right? So I'm curious, you're kind of touching on the dynamic factors that lead to more demand for multi. If you want to speak a little bit more to the data of that, I'd be curious to hear what you're seeing at NMHC there.
Yeah, so we actually just published a research notes on this topic. So every 2 years we conduct this survey on renter preferences along with Grace Hill, our partner on this. We get responses from over 170,000 renters across the US. And so the latest iteration was out in the field this summer, and the last one was out, I believe, in September of 2021. One of the questions we asked, which I thought was really helpful, is we ask renters if on their thoughts of home ownership, if they want to own a home at all, And if they do, whether or not they're actively on the market, or if they don't think that right now is the right time. And so you would expect to see kind of did that disrupt the audio at all?
You're probably fine. Don't worry about it. We can
Okay.
cut this out too. I would just keep.
Okay.
It wasn't very loud on my end, so I think you're fine.
Okay.
We had an economist on a year and a half ago who was on his back deck, and there was like the loudest bird of all time, just chirping the whole time, much louder than that phone, and we were able to work with that. So I think you'll be good.
So anyway, well, the first thing we found when looking through the data is about 17% of the apartment residents who responded said they never want to own a home. They have no interest in owning a home. So you kind of take them out of the equation. And in of the remainder, we would expect to see I guess an increase in these aspiring homeowners, the share who say that now is maybe not the right time because of how expensive home ownership has become. And we did in fact find that the share of these aspiring home buyers who are actively on the market decreased from 20.5% in 2021 to 18.2% in 2023, which I guess it doesn't seem like a huge decrease. But even when we control for things like age, income, and living arrangement, it still seemed like a significant change. So in other words, there does seem to be a shift going on, and a higher share of aspiring home buyers staying in the rental market a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight, and I do like that runner preference survey that y'all send out. It's always very helpful to see those answers. So yeah, you're seeing less active pursuit of home ownership, most likely tied to interest rates and affordability pricing that you just said. Certainly the spread between the average mortgage and cost of owning a home versus renting is as high as it's been in recent memory. I've seen some data from John Burns's group over $850, like $852 or something like that.
Yeah, we have an estimate as well that's even higher than that.
Yeah, I'm curious, what do you all say at NMHC that spread is right now?
I have it written down here. Make sure. Our most recent estimate as of the second quarter is $1,298 more per month for a newly purchased home compared to a professionally managed apartment, and also the highest it's ever been. One thing that's kind of interesting though, so our next question in that research was, is that what renters or prospective home buyers are paying attention to? Is that what's putting them off of buying a home, right? Or is it really the value of the home? So we tried to model that decision as a function, again, controlled for things like age, income, living arrangement, and both that buy to rent ratio and just the absolute value of homes by metro in 2023. And the effect of absolute home prices had much more of a strong association with that decision.
Really?
Yeah. Which seems to suggest that maybe people aren't doing this calculus, really. They're not really.
I was going to say, I don't think they're doing the numbers, right? Because at the end of the day, you got to have a budget for the month and pay for your groceries and your kids' basketball camp or whatever you have going on in your life, your car payment. That's really interesting. So people, based on what you're saying, the why is that people are just tracking home pricing essentially, and that's taking them out of the game.
If they have the down payment, then
yeah.
But I mean, there are a number of other, I guess, rational reasons for why they might be doing that. You don't know what their thoughts are on future home price appreciation. Maybe they think the market's going to keep going up, and it'll be worth it for them in the long run. Maybe they think rents will keep going up. And maybe they're really just buying a house for non-financial reasons. Like they want to renovate it the way they want to, in which case they don't really care. I mean, one of the factors that best helps, I guess, predict that purchase decision is like your living arrangement. Partnered households are much more likely to own a home. So if people are in that stage, then maybe they're just kind of not that concerned about exactly how much per month they're going to pay.
Yeah, I guess we all, not all, but many of us get to a point where the suburbs come calling, right? Want the dog in the fenced-in backyard, like that's still a little bit. But I do wonder if you're touching on an interesting cultural shift, Chris. I wanted to circle back to the fact that you kind of took 17% of the renters off the board at the beginning of this demand conversation, right? And they essentially said, I never want to buy a home. And I don't know what the historical data is if you polled Americans over the years on how many people want to own a home, but certainly for me as a Gen Xer, I can't think of a friend that I knew growing up that didn't want to buy a house. It was just the American dream, right? It felt like 100%. Again, I have no hard data to support that, but the fact that almost 1 out of 5 Americans now doesn't even consider it an option feels like a big cultural shift to me. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I did dig into a little bit, dig into that kind of cohort to see who they were. They tended to be older. So I think you probably, and a lot of them have already owned a home at some point. So it's maybe not what you're first thinking, that like these are just younger people who never want to own a home.
Yeah.
A lot of them have. So these might just be people who are getting older, who are downsizing and are kind of done with that home ownership. And maybe they're separated or widowed and living alone. So for various reasons, they have no interest in owning a home anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting. I could see, certainly there's a lot of compelling reasons not to have to mow the lawn and shovel the snow if you're in that part of the country and worry about all that stuff, right? All the maintenance associated with the house, especially later in life. Interesting. Okay. No, that's some great insight. Let's talk a little bit about vacancy. So a big part of demand is vacancy of multifamily. And I know that y'all do a really good job at NMHC tracking that across the country. So give us some feedback on what you're seeing in terms of vacancy. And if you want to regionalize this discussion, Sun Belt, West Coast, Northeast, feel free to, or speak to the national trend either way.
Yeah. So again, same thing with rent. You know, we don't have any of our own data here, so we rely on data from the census, from some private data providers such as RealPage and CoStar. Apartment vacancy rates had a pretty steady decline since the Great Financial Crisis, and reached an all-time low just as rent growth reached an all-time high, as you would expect, in late 2021, early 2022. And of course, you understand that relationship. I'm sure most of your audience understands that relationship. But I wanted to point that out. I wrote a whole piece on this just because there are some, I think, false narratives on housing and affordability that kind of persists out there. One of them being that there are plenty of homes. There are plenty of vacant homes, and if we could just put the people who want somewhere to live into those vacant homes, then we could just solve this housing shortage. And I wanted to really show that wasn't the case, and also to illustrate that another part of this narrative is that no, homes are not being intentionally left vacant. That's not good for anyone in the apartment industry. And I decided to do a deep dive into the vacancy data. I work a lot with data from the American Community Survey, which is probably one of the best. If you want estimates of things and demographics for the total US population. They have a great sample size. So I really dug into how many housing units were vacant, and why they were vacant and for how long. And about 30%, I'm going to check again, checking my numbers because I have a lot of these stats, but almost a third are just vacant temporarily. These are in between tenants, right? Or in between owners of the home. And when you look at that subset, you could also look at how long they've been vacant. A large share have been vacant for less than a month, and over half have been vacant for less than 2 months. So these aren't units that are just sitting vacant, and they're turning over pretty quickly. The small share of that group that have been vacant for like over a year, if you look at the characteristics, they're more likely to be in older buildings with like missing key features. So probably in need of like a renovation or repairs. Around 11% of vacant units are also in the process of being renovated or repaired. And then you have another third of vacant units that are vacation homes. And these are generally clustered in like your typical vacation hotspots, Jersey Shore, or like different ski towns, and are generally not the share of vacation homes are generally pretty low in downtown areas. If you look at like downtown New York, San Francisco. So in other words, the reason why it's expensive to live in New York City or San Francisco or wherever is not because there are a ton of vacant vacation homes there.
Right. Okay, so what you found in your research is, yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that this theory that there's ample housing, we just have to redistribute the people, is a false narrative, right? We've had a housing shortage in this country as long as I can recall, even with the increased amount of deliveries we're seeing on the multi side in 2023 and what we'll see in 24, because those projects are already underway, so they're not hard to forecast. We still have a shortage problem, without a doubt, and that seems to continue to be the story. So look beyond the headlines, I guess, is your your insight from that research.
Yeah, well, I mean, affordability is obviously an issue, and it's been getting worse over time. And I think we all have to agree on certain things if we're going to start talking about solutions.
Yeah, but I think the data that you're suggesting shows it's primarily a supply issue amongst a host of other factors, right, that lead to affordability. But at the core of it all, we don't have enough supply. And that's one of the main issues that need to be resolved, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which goes to, local governance and public goodwill and NIMBYism and like all the reasons why projects get shut down, as well as in this environment, finance constraints and all that with the capital markets, which this isn't a capital markets broadcast, so we'll skip that today.
Right.
I would be curious to hear, you had some research that you've done, Chris, specifically around transportation on this topic of affordability and the play between home ownership and renting. So I've never really dug in on that, so I'd love to learn some more. So educate us.
Well, yeah, so this was a topic that I was interested in because I felt like places like New York City or Washington, D.C., where I live, were kind of being unfairly targeted regarding affordability and how expensive it is to live in places like this. Because, for instance, where I live in downtown D.C., and I live in an apartment that some people might consider expensive, but I live downtown and I don't need a car, and I walk to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that saves you a lot of money. So the typical metric for affordability is to look at the share of your income you're paying on housing costs. But really, if you care about affordability more generally, you should be accounting for things like transportation and car expenses. It's pretty great not having to pay for a car. So I again looked at data from American Community Survey, but I, along with that, looked at data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, looking at what people were paying in for their transportation and for their vehicles. And I mean, as you would expect, people living in more expensive areas, they might be paying more overall, but they're able to save some money frequently by owning fewer vehicles and commuting to work either by walking or taking public transportation.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting thesis, probably for many households. After the cost of home ownership, if that's what they are, the next could be transportation, certainly, and probably the third one is food, right? Groceries and eating out and all that. It's pretty high on most people's list.
Yeah.
As well. So, okay, interesting. I'm not sure you're going to convince me on the food front that it's less expensive to live in New York City than Raleigh, North Carolina, but
it's probably better food though.
It probably is. It probably is. We've got some mean barbecue restaurants in Raleigh. I'll have to introduce you someday.
Okay. Yeah.
You're right, without a doubt, in terms of what they offer. So, okay. Let's talk a little bit about the vacancy trends that you've seen historically. You talked about them peaking at the time that rents peaked, late 21, early 2022. So talk us through kind of your insights on, you touched on that point very briefly, and I do want to circle back to that because vacancy is such an important topic to owners, right? And wanted to kind of get a little more insight on that topic. So let's drill in on vacancy for a minute.
Or I guess rather the opposite, that they reached the lowest point.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I should say the highest point of occupancy. Forgive me.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
But since then, the market has been softening since then, and vacancy rates have ticked up from that record low, but still maybe historically low compared to 2010 or 2009. So so we don't really forecast here amongst our research team. So I don't know if I have a good prediction as to where rent growth or vacancies are going forward. Obviously, we have a couple things to look out for. One being, like I talked about earlier, we saw a pretty big surge in the number of multifamily units being started in 2021 and 2022. Kind of, I guess, motivated in large part by that rent growth that we saw. And I think developers would have liked to even start more. There were significant barriers in terms of materials and labor that we recorded, and we have a construction survey that we put out. But completions really, they didn't flow through to completions during that time, and we're just seeing that supply start to come online now. So and that's very that varies considerably by market. So kind of getting lost in this train of thought, I think a big part of that surge in construction was in the Sun Belt. We saw a big shift in demand away from coastal areas, really away from smaller units in coastal areas toward larger units in secondary markets and areas of the Sun Belt, and in areas where it's easier to build. So we got a better response from supply there, and that's going to have a downward effect on rent going forward. So if I were to forecast rent growth or vacancies, you would have to look at, where all that construction has been taking place and what's expected to come online. But there's also the demand component. In the short term, I feel like everyone's been talking about the same thing. The Federal Reserve raising interest rates, when they're going to stop. And I don't know, but we've been, looking at inflation when you exclude the cost of shelter.
Mm-hmm.
We're there. We're already kind of at the Fed's target.
We're at 2%. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that data this week. That's right.
And this is something we've talked about repeatedly, that we know the cost of shelter as recorded by CPI is going to come down. We got the release tomorrow, by the way. It's really just a matter of that change in asking rents that we've already recorded. We've already seen that softening, seen that filter through to CPI, but there's a considerable lag there. And we don't even know what the effect is going to be on the interest rate hikes that have already taken place. There's long and variable lags between monetary policy and the effect on the economy. So, yeah, the big question, how that all is going to affect economic growth, the job market, obviously key factors in apartment demand. I think longer term, though, there's more of a case for the fundamentals being really sound. Mm-hmm. In that, so there might be this short-term period where we have a bit of supply coming online, creating some softness and some pullback in demand. But if you look at the results from our construction survey, you see a greater share or a growing share of our respondents saying, citing as an obstacle to building the rising cost of capital for one, mm-hmm. and also the economic uncertainty and economic growth more broadly. So longer term, I think that developers and builders are going to pull back. They're pulling back because of this market softness, and so any short-term softness in rents, I feel like, will just be shorter term.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think the market fundamentals are still strong. I do agree that many developers, we've seen it with a lot of clients, are walking away from projects. We sell a lot of dirt at Capstone for multifamily development, and if you're not already underway and have your financing set up and you've gone hard on the deal, we're seeing a lot of groups just extend and wait to see if the market conditions improve and the cost of capital improves, because quite frankly, today a lot of these deals just don't pencil regardless of the cost of the dirt. It's the capital costs, whereas it was labor and materials a year and a half ago, to your earlier point. So yeah, I think we'll see that. However, there's a silver lining in all of that, Chris, right? So for those well-capitalized, savvy developers who figure out a way to come out of the ground now, they'll have virtually no competition in 2.5 years during lease up, right? So
yeah, unless everyone is thinking like that, right?
Yeah, we're just not seeing that number of projects coming out of the ground right now in most markets. So it's definitely down. I was at a Built National Development Conference in Nashville last week and spoke on one of the panels and talked to all the way up to the REIT level developers, and most of them, 80% of their projects are on ice right now because of the capital market. So it was a very consistent message, I would say, in the room, even as of last week.
Right, and of course, that's not what we want to see from an affordability standpoint.
No.
And there obviously we have a housing shortage. Freddie Mac comes out with good estimates of what that shortage is for the entire housing market. We had our own study conducted that estimated that we had a shortage in 2021 of 600,000 apartment units, and that we would need to build an additional 3.7 million through 2035 to meet future demand and losses to the apartment stock. And, we have these few years of really high construction, and people get complacent and say, well, it looks like we're building plenty. But, that's just a few years, and you could very easily have this reversal as the market softens and as you have an environment like we have now with rising interest rates. So if you really want to continue at that pace of construction to make housing more affordable, you have to do things outside of what you can't control in the capital markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a huge need. And you're right. I think you're taking the long-term perspective at NMHC, which makes sense, right? Like, we still are short on housing overall. And if we continue to see projects dry up, it's exacerbating that issue, which then exacerbates affordability with lack of supply. So I agree. It's a big circle. The challenges are, we live in a society that reads the headline of the newspapers or their Twitter feed or whatever, right? And they say, we got an affordability problem. Don't pay your landlord. Go get in a line somewhere and protest. And I'm not sure we're necessarily getting to the core issues and really solving them at that point by having those quick little talking points that are fed you by the media. I agree.
Absolutely.
So what else are you working on these days at NMHC, Chris? I think you have an upcoming conference on student housing. Tell our audience a little bit about that.
So we'll be in Vegas next week for our student housing conference, and we'll be releasing our 2020, I'm trying to think, we call it 2023 or 2020, our 2023 income and expense report based on financial data from 2022. So I'm really excited to talk about those results. We're going to be able to compare what's been going on from an operation with rents and operating expenses, vacancies, concessions for student housing operators, comparing 2022 with 2020, heart of COVID to coming out of COVID. So that's going to be available for sale. So I'm going to be, Vegas next week. Vegas also first week of November for OpTech. And then obviously I'll be in San Diego for our annual meeting for anyone attending there.
Yeah, we'll be there as well. We look forward to that. That's always a big event. And I'm sure many of the investors on this podcast will be attending as well. Well, great. Anything else you want to touch on at NMHC of note before we wrap it up today?
I guess I would encourage anyone listening who's interested in these topics to go on our website, check out the research section of our website. A lot of these are much more, extensive research projects that I've worked on that you could find in the research notes section of our website. We have a market trends analysis that is also under research, and also our quarterly survey of apartment market conditions, which is actually in the field right now. We'll be reporting on those results in a webinar next week for anyone who's interested.
Oh, that's perfect. And for those who are listening to the podcast, that's going to be sometime the week of the 15th of October. So you keep your eye on that. Keep your eye on the website. Well, thank you, Chris. We definitely appreciate it. And I know you do a ton of research and a ton of work, and we're giving the Cliff Notes version on this podcast, but maybe we whet some appetite for people to dig in and see a little bit more of the raw research and understand the why. So definitely appreciate your time talking multifamily today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Multifamily Method. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps our podcast get discovered by other savvy investors like yourself. Subscribe to Multifamily Method for free on your podcast platform of choice. Find out more about Capstone Companies at capstone-companies.com. Multifamily Method is executive produced by Capstone Companies. Audio production for the podcast provided by Andy Go of Gojo Studios, and video production by Yash Mistry of mystery projects.